Am I very laggy on my end?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of US Stock Speaking.
Hello. Hi, guys.
Yep, hope you are having a good Sunday so far. Yep. So today we are actually going to talk about this stock. This hype up stock called Netflix. Right. So if you've been following the news, right, Netflix was actually making the headlines last week. Yeah, it actually dropped tremendously. At one point up to about 40%, right, on just a single day. Right. So we thought it'll be a good time to actually share our thoughts on Netflix. Whether this stock is actually worth investing or trading, right, at this juncture, right. So without further ado, let me invite FINANCIAlmissy to give us a brief uh, uh, give us her perspective, right, on Netflix. Right, over to you, FINANCIAlmissy.
Hey, guys. So it's me here again. We are back here on our weekly, Sunday Facebook Live session where we are going to talk about how are we going to dissect stocks. It's so exciting to actually be back here every weekly, to actually explain to you guys on how we proceed with our different techniques, strategies, whatever you call it, on how we do investments, how we do trading. So it's so exciting. If you guys are there with us right now, just help us to like and share this video so that more people will actually, be able to receive valuable information from us. Right, guys, so please do like and share this video so that we know that you are here with us, so that we know that you are enjoying our content so far, right? So as you can see, I'm currently outside, out of my comfort zone as well. I'm in the car park right now, so please pardon me for some interruptions here and there. It's pretty weird for me to be, speaking to you guys out of nowhere. So without further ado, let me just share my slides. Just give me a minute. Okay. So today, as what the trade engineer actually mentioned, we're going to talk about Netflix, right? Give it a while. Right, so Netflix, I'm pretty sure everybody know what is Netflix about. On Friday itself, it's so exciting that it actually had a very huge drop yet again. It closed at $215, of which constitutes a 1.24% drop on Friday itself. So what is exactly happening with Netflix? Just look at that chart over there. It's so exciting. That is actually a weekly chart for the past 5 years. And you can see my LinkedIn has actually gained traction since 2015. We've been going all the way up, and it peaks in 2021, right? And now we are seeing big candlestick bars that is having a dip, 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 and dip again. Wow, is it a time for entry? We are currently back at 2018. Wow, back at 2018, yeah. So is it time for you to enter? Let's take a look. Right. So before I start proper, yes, I forgot to say about this. Any views, opinion, references, everything that we are going to talk about today is actually our own personal point of view. It should not be considered as a financial advice, yeah, guys. So if you guys are with me, know that what I always say is that please do your own due diligence because we are always wrong. You need to know your own strategy and act as per your own strategy, guys. Right, so if you guys are okay there, do give me a thumbs up so that I know that you guys understood what I just said, right? Never intended to be a financial advice. Please do your own due diligence. That is really very important, and I cannot emphasize more, right? Okay, so indicator-wise, right, so we've been talking about this for the longest time already. Every week I've been talking the same thing, indicators. How is the general market trend doing right now? As you can see, we are still moving within the range that I suggest to you guys wait for the past 1 month. We are going to go in range for the time being, whether you like it or whether you're not. We are going to go in range. So if you want to actually play the market right now, please do be very cautious about it, because we are moving in range. Number one. Number two is the volatility is huge, fluctuation is high. It is very possible for us to see huge candlesticks appreciation or even dipping, right? As you can tell, Friday was a very deep one. So please do your own due diligence. How are you going from here? We do not know. All we know is that in mid-May, which is next month, a couple of weeks, the Fed is yet going to announce another interest rate adjustment, right? Are we going to see a lower interest rate? I don't think so. Highly not possible, or rather, almost not possible. Are we going to see increment? Definitely. The question is, how high is the interest rate increment? Is it going to be a 0.25 base point? No. The Fed has actually, suggested that it might be as much as a 0.5 base point, right? So please embrace that. Volatility in the next 1 year is going to be very, very huge, right? Okay, so what is Netflix do? I'm pretty sure that everybody knows what's Netflix, right? But for those of you guys who doesn't know, Netflix itself is an entertainment services, right? So it provides TV series, documentaries, feature films, mobile games, or so on and so forth. It is a entertainment services that is online. Okay, it's very exciting. Sector-wise, it's communication service. It actually blew quite a fair bit in 2020, 2021 because of how people are forced to stay at home, and as what the normal phrase says, Netflix and chill, right? But I do want to put you guys into perspective as well. Netflix itself, right? You kind of think about it, there's a loophole in the subscription service for Netflix, in the sense that it doesn't mean that everybody has to purchase or subscribe to Netflix in order to watch it, but rather there's something you call that you can share bundles with family, share bundles with your friends, and so on and so forth, just to reach on the cheapest available options, right? So while it's actually causing the dip in the last few weeks, it's actually because that Netflix, the total revenue actually did not meet expectations, and they see lower than expected subscription users. So the number of people subscribing to Netflix actually decreased, and Netflix themselves has also announced that yes, it is going to decrease further in the next year to see income, right? So this is what actually causes a huge dip for the past 1 week or so, right? So how is it doing financially? As usual, we look at three different components: the income statement, the balance sheet, as well as the cash flow statement. So in terms of our income statement, right, total revenue, total income is actually very good. Year on year has been increasing. The net profit margin for Netflix itself is based at 7.88% based on the latest report that was announced. Current ratio 0.95, not fantastic. Debt to equity ratio 0.97. Okay, which is not perfect, but it's still within the acceptable range. The PEG ratio is based at 1.64, of which is also meant that you can foresee that Netflix can be a bit overvalued based on this PEG ratio, right? Cash flow wise, not the most ideal. The cash flow from operation has been pretty much fluctuating for the past 3 years. Cash from investment and cash from financial is actually a negative, which means to say the company is not exactly making as much money as we thought that they should be, being a media giant, right? That everybody knows about it. So in terms of free cash flow wise, it has been pretty much negative of the past 3 years, of which in 2021 is actually a huge positive, because everybody flocks to Netflix. So we wouldn't be surprised about that in any case. But nevertheless, as investors, we want to see historically how is the company doing, whether there's any potential growth factor. Because don't forget, Netflix itself is a growth company. You want to invest in a growth company that has potential to grow rather than a company that is stagnant. But not to forget, right? Netflix, no matter what, although it's a giant, so is a media giant, don't forget about its competitions. We look at Disney Plus, we look at an Apple TV. There's a lot of competitions going up there in the market right now. So the question that I want to impose to you guys is, what makes Netflix so special that people would want to actually subscribe to Netflix instead of other service providers? Right. This is a question most investors, if you're looking at investing in Netflix, please do consider. Are you yourself investing in Netflix? In the sense that, are you yourself subscribe to Netflix and whether you see a potential in Netflix? Right? So I'll leave you there to think about it. Okay, so yep, according to discounted cash flow, right, when I did the calculation, Netflix itself is currently overvalued because the increasing value is about 263 thereabout, so it's a bit a bit undervalued. It's a bit contradicting to what I said previously, right, using the PEG ratio, of which it might be slightly overvalued. So yes, I get that there's a bit of contradictions over there, but do keep in mind that there are different methods to calculate the intrinsic value, and we cannot use one value to actually determine whether it is the true intrinsic value of a particular company. Alright, so is it a good time to enter for Netflix? We always want to look at the technical analysis. Alright, so let me just show you this graph. It's a bit complicated over there. But nevertheless, this is a day graph for Netflix itself. I put it as a 1 year day graph. Okay, we saw that Netflix peaked in November, December in 2021, double top. Double top, when you see this double top, right, which is the highest line, the two peak, right, when you see this particular kind of chart, right, you know that, or rather you can expect that it might go down. And indeed it went down. You see the second highest dotted sloping dotted line, it went down quite a steep bit, alright, of which the earning reports and those sentiments, it went further down. So there's a flash down, and now it flashed down further and ended at 215 on Friday itself. Okay, the slopes are getting steep, gentle, and it should go more gentle. Eventually, we'll have a rebound. But have we reached the rebound right now such that we can actually enter and take opportunity in this particular company? The answer is very simple, very straightforward. Not yet. Right? We want to see that the purple line is above the blue line to know that there's actually a change in momentum. Alright? So, and very importantly, I want you guys to know that is, do not enter a particular stock regardless of whether you're investing or whether you're trading when you see flush out. Okay, that's very dangerous, because what goes lower can always go lower, what goes higher can always go higher. You always want to work on momentum. Alright, so currently what we are seeing, three major issues: previous flush down, not once but twice, medium, short term, long term trend, all bearish. Okay, and the momentum itself is bearish because why you see lower lows and lower highs. Alright, so if you want to actually invest in Netflix, I really want to actually suggest that you guys have a stronger conviction of this particular company, the growth factor of this company, to see whether there's any change in trend before entering. Right, so this is all that I have for you guys while I am here in the car park, and I will leave you guys to our dear trade engineer to share with you guys about the perspective of trading Netflix. Right, thank you. Over to you, the trade engineer.
All right, thanks, FINANCIAlmissy, for the awesome sharing. Right, do give this video a like or a love, right, if you enjoy her sharing for Netflix. Right, and without further ado, I'll move on to my segment, my own perspective on Netflix. Right, and to do that, I would share my screen. All right, yes. All right, so here's my screen. Right, so as what we mentioned, right, the Netflix has actually crashed quite tremendously. Right, in fact, if you look back on 20th of April, it had actually crashed a whopping 35%. Right, so the question here, right, is what's next? Right, what's next for Netflix? Right, what is to come? And as what you listen to what FINANCIAlmissy has mentioned, right, it does offer some perspectives, right, on the future direction of Netflix. Right, so I'll offer my own perspective, but before I do so, if you're here live with me, don't forget to give this video a like. And once again, right, before I start off, before I delve into Netflix, I should do a brief recap of the previous stock that we mentioned last week. Right, so last week we did go through this particular stock called Target, right, ticker symbol TGT. Right, so if you haven't done so already, you can also check out, last week video for more of our sharing, right? But here's a quick recap, right? Just to jog everyone's memory, right? So this is just taken from my TikTok video, right? That gives a quick summary, right, of what I mentioned last week. Right, so basically, we did look at it on a daily basis, right? And we saw that there was this downtrend line, right? That was cleared convincingly on 7th April, right? And it was testing this first horizontal resistance line, right? At the level of 236, right? It slightly cleared on Friday then, right? And we're also looking at this other two horizontal resistance line, right? As the other layer of resistance that could be challenged, right, in time to come. Additionally, you also look at the support level, right? The first horizontal support, right? That was still trading above it, as well as the uptrend line, right? You're still trading above this uptrend line. Right, and the RSI, we did mention that it looks, a bit overbought, and MACD wise, right, it also looks positive, right? But the question is whether it can continue to do so. Right, so there was a quick recap, right? Me delve into the details, right, on what I mentioned last week, right? So we did mention this downtrend line, right? So it's a good sign that it crossed it, right, on 7th April. And, ever since then, it has traded above this line, right? So we wanted to see that it continues to trade above this line for more upside momentum. And, we also wanted to try to actually clear this horizontal resistance convincingly, right? So that there could be further upside to this stock. Right, so if it does have some upside, we'll be looking at this two horizontal resistance line, right, as the next layer of resistance. And it'll be a good sign, right, if the price actually remains supported, right, by this first horizontal support, right, and continues to that, that will actually imply that the price might actually continue to move upwards. Yep, and the uptrend line, right, for this stock to continue moving up, it has to remain supported by this uptrend line. Right, but we did mention that the RSI was a bit concerning, right? It was a bit overbought, right? And MACD, right, it was also positive, which is a good sign, but it remains to be seen whether it can continue to be positive. Right, so that was the recap, right? The quick recap last week, right? So in short, right, there were both bulls and bear arguments for Target, right? On the bull side, right, we did see that it actually convincingly cleared the downtrend line, right? It slightly cleared that first horizontal resistance, and we are trading above the support level, both on the horizontal support and the uptrend line. In our indicator, you saw the MACD was also positive, and the gap was increasing. But on the bear side of things, we did saw that daily RSI approaching overbought levels. And if we look at the hourly time scale and shorter time scale, we did see some bearish divergence, right? In that the price and the RSI were moving in the opposite direction. Right, so what did we conclude then, right, for Target? At that time, we did mention that, there isn't a lot of opportunity in Target, right? There could be some small upside, right, on the shorter time scale. So we could actually, if we are actually a risk taker, we could, enter, but there is, less benefit, but higher risk, right? So we decided then to actually, either skip this trade or take a quick scalp, right? Right. So and if we take a quick scalp, we could use the second and third resistance level as a potential target price. Yep. But if it actually if the support doesn't fall, right, if the first horizontal support actually breaks, right, then we should wait until it actually tests the uptrend line at the next level of support. Right. So what happened, right? What happened ever since then, right? For the past 5 days of trading. Right, so here's a quick breakdown of what happened to Target in the past week. Right, so first of all, you can see that actually the price actually moved higher, right? So it continued to trade above this downtrend line, right? for the past week, right? And you see at the first horizontal resistance, right? It actually continued to trade above this first horizontal resistance, right? So it continued to push above this line, right, on the 18th of April, which is this candlestick over here. And ever since then, it has stayed above, right, from this first horizontal resistance. Right. And let's look at the other horizontal resistance, right? The second and the third that I mentioned last week. Right. So the second resistance, at 240 to 241, right? And the third was at 247 US dollars. Right. So it cleared, both levels pretty convincingly, right? It cleared, the second resistance on 19th of April, Tuesday. And, before testing the third resistance, right? And it actually cleared the third resistance on Wednesday, right? But after that, right, after it cleared, it actually hit a high, right, of $254, right, thereabouts on 21st of April, Thursday, right, before actually correcting down, right, and it's now, testing the second resistance level at 240, right, as the support now, right. So it hasn't actually reached there yet, so we shall wait and see to see whether this second resistance will become the strong support, right. If not, it will fall back further, right. Yeah, so the first horizontal support, right, it actually continued to trade above this support level. And the uptrend line, right, of course, it still continues to trade above this uptrend line. The daily RSI, right, so daily RSI, right, it actually continued to, head towards the overbought level. It actually went above the overbought level, right, slightly. And once it hit there, it actually came back down, right, seen by this past 2 days, right. Daily MACD, right? For the whole week, it continued to be positive, right? So the gap was quite similar, right? Until recently, when the price came down, so the gap, started to narrow down, right? Right. So in conclusion, right? What can we conclude, right, for target, right? So there was a slight trade win, right? Even though we, some of you might not have taken the position because the risk benefit ratio, wasn't that favorable. But for those of you who did, right, congratulations. It went actually somewhat according to plan, right? It did have some small upside, right? So basically, right, if you actually assume the following trade plan, right, if you had entered on Monday, right, after clearing that first resistance level, right, and you took profit at the second and third resistance level, right, you could have actually gained about 1.7% and 4.7% respectively, right? So it's a small win, right, over a few days. Yep. But after clearing the third resistance, it had a bit more upside, right? So that was a bit unexpected, right? It actually, went a bit higher from the third resistance point. But thereafter, it didn't really last very long, and actually it broke down below that third resistance level, and now it's going to test the second resistance level as the next layer of support, right? So this was the brief summary of target, right, last week. So, I hope, for those of you who are risk takers, you might have made some money. But for those of you who didn't, enter and skip this trade, not to worry, right? There are more opportunities in the market. Right. So if you like what I've been sharing so far, right, don't forget to hit that like or love button, right? All right. And now, without further ado, right, let us move on to today's stock pick. Right. So today we're talking about Netflix, right? So FINANCIAlmissy has given us a very good overview and perspective of Netflix, right? So I shall be offering my point of view, right, from the technical perspective. Right. But before I do so, right, let me first, give some introduction and background for Netflix, right, so that we know whether what this stock doing and what is this stock all about. Right, so this is the overall price chart for Netflix. Right, so you can see that this stock has actually risen very quite tremendously, right, from 2020 all the way to before 2022, right. So it actually risen from $200 all the way to a high of about 600 plus US dollars, right. And ever since then, it actually went down, right, quite tremendously as well. So now it's trading at a mere $200 plus, which was back to where we were, in 2018, right, thereabouts. Right. And in particular, right, we would like to point out, this particular gap down, right, on very recently, right, on the 20th of April, right. And this was, if we do the math, it's about 35%, right. So what could be some of the reasons, right, for causing this big gap down, right? So it's not very usual to see such a big gap down for such a, a big company, right? So that is there really something really wrong with this company? So let's look a bit, at some of the news headlines, right? That might offer some clues on why it actually fell so tremendously. Right. So I've taken some news article, right? The news headlines from various places. Right? So first of all, I took from the Guardian, right? So over here, it mentioned that Netflix has actually fallen more than 35% after this streamer loses over 200,000 subscribers. Right, so that is actually the main reason why it actually fell. Right, it's the first time it actually lost subscribers, for quite some time. Right, and in fact, it actually mentioned, right, the company also mentioned, right, that it is going to lose more subscribers. Right, its projection that it's going to lose 2 million more over the next quarter. Right, so that is something that is it's not good in the present. It's also not good in the future, if this really is going to come true. Right, and there's another news article from bbc.com, right? So BBC also mentioned, like, 50 billion, right, was actually wiped off Netflix value, right, as all the subscribers quit. Not all the subscribers, but as most substantial amount of subscribers quit, right? So that also alluded to the 35% drop in Netflix price. And over at CNBC, right, CNBC also mentioned that Netflix has closed down more than 35%, right, wiping off 50 billion of its market capitalization, right? So, so it also mentioned the same thing, right? It plunged because it lost subscribers in the recent quarter, right? And it also mentioned that analysts, right, many analysts have also downgraded this stock, right? In fact, at least 9. There's a substantial number of analysts, right, that actually downgraded this stock on its disappointing report. So let's look at some further details, right, on why it dropped, right. So you delve into the articles, right. It does offer some further insight, right. So first of all, right, we do have, you can see, this is taken from Forbes.com, right, and what I mentioned, right, is that basically, this is the first time, right, that Netflix has lost subscriber in over a decade, right? That is very substantial, right? In 10 years, right, this is the first time it has lost subscribers, right? So that is, you can tell that is really unexpected, which is why maybe, everyone went in the panic mode and started to sell this stock. Additionally, there was a wave of downgrades from Wall Street analysts, right? And in fact, right, another analysts mentioned, right, they were suggesting not to buy the dip, right? Because what he mentioned that Netflix plan to revive subscriber growth is likely to take years, right? It's not going to be immediate. It's going to take some time, right? So why did it lose subscribers, right? So over here, right, he mentioned that the company actually blamed it on password sharing, right? So if you have been using Netflix, you would know that you are able to share passwords, right? So that is in itself a boon and a bane for this particular stock, right? And that is also increased competition from rival streaming services. So there is new streaming services that are coming up. People are moving on to other streaming services and foregoing Netflix, right? Right, and analysts downgraded is this stock also because of its lackluster first quarter earnings report, right? In fact, the price target were all slashed, right, by at least 10 different Wall Street analysts, right? So one example was Bank of America, right? They actually double downgraded the stock, right? And other firms also slashed estimate by more than half, right? So all these are very significant price target drops, right? Right. So on the other hand, right, they do mention that, the company did mention that is some hope for the future, right? It is trying to clamp down, right, on password sharing, right, as well as to introduce a cheaper advertising supported subscription tier, right? It's something they have, constantly shunned against, right, shunned away from, right? But now they are thinking of introducing advertising, right, to Netflix. However, right, although this looks promising, right, a lot of people still, think that this is not in the immediate term. It is, quite a long term away. In fact, it's years away. So, people are thinking of selling it first, right, and maybe, seeing how it pans out in the future. Right. So, they also mentioned that there might not be any noticeable impact until 2024, right? So now it's only 2022. So that's at least 2 years away, right? So, and did say that, it might take a while, right, to believe that Netflix can actually return back the growth. Right. So this is, some personal comments, right, from some analysts, right? So one of these analysts say there's nothing much to get excited about, right, for the immediate term, right, in the next few months. And in fact, one of them also said it's donezo for now, right, for Netflix, right? And there is, a wave of downgrades, right? But there is still some analysts that had a buy rating for Netflix, right? But this is the first time, right, the number of analysts that had a buy rating for Netflix is dropped below 50%, right? Specifically, just 41% now. Right. So, as what I mentioned earlier, right, some of the things, some of the challenges that Netflix is facing is increased competition, right, from rival companies, right, as well as, now there is going to be a more saturated, and filled with, a multitude of services offering compelling content, right, at prices lower than Netflix. So how is Netflix going to, improve on its competitive advantage? Right, that is the question to be asked, right? So, as of now, I don't think many of the analysts are very bullish about its prospect, right? That is why it actually, dropped down quite tremendously. Right. So, I also went to check another article, right? This is from Full.com, right, on its take, right, of why it dropped, why Netflix dropped. So there's some common reasons here, right, on the loss of the subscribers, right? Which was a shock, right? Because, actually previously the company mentioned that it would actually gain 2.5 million subscribers, right? So it actually, was far off its estimate, right, in that sense. Right, but if we actually delve into the company's statement, right, it's noteworthy to point out that the company did mention, right, part of the reason, right, is because it actually, the service in Russia was suspended, right, and with this suspension in Russia, right, that actually resulted in a net loss of 700,000 subscribers, right. So if you actually net this off, right, the number of net subscribers actually increased by 500,000, right? So it it actually might not be so bad, right? Might not be so dire, right? But although they did came out with this statement, right? Investors were not pacified in that sense, right? Especially when it also says that it's going to lose 2 million subscribers in the current quarter, right? But it's not all doom and gloom, right? There could be some potential catalysts for this company, right? So as what was mentioned previously, right, it is looking, the CEO of the company is looking, right, to actually make things right, to actually spur the company towards further growth, right? So it is now open, right, in offering a lower tier subscription tier with ads, right, with advertisements on your platform, right? So for those of you who use Netflix, you have known that one of the features of Netflix is that it does not have advertisements, right? But now it is thinking of doing so. It's thinking of adding ads as an alternative source of income, right? But then again, this takes about 2 years to implement, right? So this depends on the take, right? If it actually works out for them, this might pan out for the company in terms of increased revenue, right? But in the immediate term, right, we might not see a lot of upside, right, for this company because it's going to take 2 years, right, to implement. Nevertheless, right, there was this particular analyst, right, that actually upgraded Netflix shares, right, So unlike other analysts, right, this analyst actually upgraded the shares of Netflix, right, from a hold to a sell, right, or from a sell to a hold, right, So basically, she upgraded it to a hold, right, and basically her argument, right, is that all along she always felt that Netflix needed to create a cheaper advertising supported tier to boost subscriber growth, right? So since Netflix is thinking of doing that, she has upgraded the shares, right? So these are some of the things to look out for Netflix, right? As of the moment, right? And if we look at another article from Foo.com, right? There are other potential catalysts. Like first of all, is the valuation, right? So in terms of valuation, right? If we work out the PE ratio, right? A PE ratio now, if we do a quick calculation, is actually close to 20, right? And this PE ratio is actually pretty low, right? In fact, it's not seen in nearly 10 years, right? And you look back, compare against other companies, right? Other similar companies like Comcast and Warner Bros., right? It is now more comparable, right? In fact, it's actually cheaper than Disney now, right? So there could be some people who come in to buy because of a cheap valuation. If we look at the financials, right? I think FINANCIAlmissy has gone through quite a bit on the financials, but let's see what this article has to say about its financials, right? So what I mentioned here, right, is that revenue, right? Revenue is still growing, right? In fact, it grew by 10%. And subscriber number, although it lost subscribers this time around, but overall, right, it has risen 7% year over year. Right. In contrast, right, net income has only dropped by more than 6%, right? But if you look back, why net income actually dropped, right? The reason is because it actually increased spending on technology development and general and administrative expenses, right? And actually, other things like interest and other income drop, right? Yep, and let's look at cash flow as well, right? Cash flow itself, it looks quite promising, right? First quarter free cash flow, right, came in at 802 million, which was actually higher, right, 16% higher than 1 year ago. Total debt also fell, right? So that's a good sign as well, right? But 858 million, right? So all these, like all in all, added some strength to its balance sheet, right? So in terms of financials, it might be actually looking pretty good, pretty decent with the price correction now, right? And in terms of outlook, right? There could be some outlook as what I mentioned previously, right? So it's still forecasting revenue growth, right? And it is, as what I mentioned, they are planning this lower cost ad supported option to attract customers. Additionally, they're also thinking of moving into gaming, right? That's the hype as well, right? And all this could actually increase interest in Netflix, right? Right, so some analysts also predicted that Netflix might actually grow by 15%, right, next year, right? And some see that these current struggles are temporary only, right? So these are some of the things to take note of, right, in terms of both the bull and bear arguments for Netflix, right? So consolidating all this, right, you might be a bit confused, right? So should I buy Netflix? Should I sell Netflix, or what, right? So what is the future direction of Netflix? So to understand this and remove all the noise from the news, right? Me being the trade engineer, I'll look at the technicals, right? As they do offer some hints on what the future price action will entail. Right, but before I do so, right, if you're enjoying this sharing so far, right, don't forget to click that like or love button. Right, and now let's check out the price chart for more details. Right, so over here, right, I have Netflix, right, on the monthly chart, right, monthly chart basis, right. So you can see, right, I've drawn this uptrend line, right. So you are supported here, right, tested here, and you can see very recently, right, after this strong price correction down, right, it is challenging this uptrend line, this long-term uptrend line at the moment, right. So this uptrend line, you can see, it has been held since 2013, right. So it has been nearly 10 years, right, this uptrend line has been holding, right? So now it's actually challenging this 10 years uptrend line, right? Okay, so actually it's 2012, right? So it's really 10 years, exactly 10 years, right? And we do have to see this uptrend line, right? This is a very critical uptrend line, right? Because it has been supporting the whole uptrend movement of this particular stock, right? So actually, if it actually breaks below these lines convincingly, right, it might, introduce a new wave of selling, right, and start a new downtrend, right, for Netflix, right? But however, right, if this is supported, right, it could imply, right, that the uptrend, right, can still, still remains, right? This stock might still be prone for further upside, right? So, so we do have to watch and see, right, to see whether this line, remains convincingly supported, or will it actually break down, right? So that the monthly chart gives us a a holistic overview of the whole stock, right? But if we zoom in, right, into the shorter term, right, in terms of hourly, right, hourly chart analysis, right, here's the hourly chart for Netflix, right? So this is the particular day where it get down 35%, right? And ever since then, it's been trading quite a low price, right? So I'd like to point out, like, this particular downtrend line, right? So so on the short-term basis, right, on this hourly time scale, right, we can draw a downtrend line, and you can see that it is now resisted by this downtrend line, right? So to see some bounce in price, right, for Netflix, right, it does have to cross this short-term downtrend line, right, because this is the immediate resistance, right? Once it clears this immediate downtrend line, we might see some short-term rebound in price, right? In fact, it might try to cover the gap, right? But we shall see how it goes. Right? It has to first of all clear this downtrend line convincingly, right? And we can also look at this horizontal support, right? You can see that it has been testing this horizontal support ever since it has gapped down, right? So this horizontal support is about $210 to $212, right? And it is the immediate support for short-term prices, right? So if this remains supported, right, you might see some price rebound, right? Some price rebound in Netflix, right? You can see that it was tested quite a number of times, right? 1, 2, 3, right, on this hourly time scale, right? If not, right, if it breaks down convincingly, right, then it could start a new wave of selling. Right, and if you look at the RSI and the price, right, we do see some indication that it might be bottoming out, right? So you can see that the price is forming a slightly lower low, right? But we do see some higher lows, right, for RSI, right? So this is typically an indication of bottoming out, right? But take note that this is on the hourly time scale, so it just indicates bottoming out in the short term. Right, and MACD, right? MACD on the hourly time scale, right? It has turned positive as well, right? So that is a good sign as well, right? It does, offer further confirmation that there could be some rebound in prices in the near term, right? So we do want to see this continuing, right? We do want to see the MACD continue to be positive, right? So now that's a quick, my quick take, right? A quick perspective on what's Netflix, what's my take on Netflix. Right, so in conclusion, right, there are both bull and bear arguments for Netflix once again. Right, so on the bull side of things, right, it has been trading above that long-term uptrend line, right, since 2012. So 10 years, right, is a very long-term uptrend line. Right, and it looks like it's going to break past that short-term downtrend line, right? But we do have to watch out. It hasn't broken past it yet, right? But if it breaks past it convincingly, we might be able to see some rebound in prices. Like currently, it's also supported by the short-term horizontal support, like at 210 to 212 US dollars, and we do see some bullish divergence, right? Those are the price and RSI, as well as positive MACD, right, on the hourly time scale. However, on the bear side of things, like bear side, we are not sure, right, whether the support will actually hold both on the long term as well as the short term. right? And the negative sentiment is still very much dominant for Netflix, right? Due to the recent news, right? So the sentiment might actually cause the price to actually come down even further, right? And overall, right, the market now is still very volatile, right? So we do have to watch out as well. So what should we do for trading, right? So this is my own perspective, right? Please do your own due diligence before actually, placing a trade, right, for Netflix. So what I suggest here, right, is we can enter a long trade in the short to mid term, right, but on this particular condition, right? So if you're looking at short term or scalping, right, short term trades, right, we do have to wait for the immediate downtrend line to be broken convincingly first, right? And if it does, right, you can enter with a first target price at 226 to 228, right? That's the first resistance, right? And the second target price at about 247 US dollars, right? So that's the second resistance level, right? And we can set a stop loss, right, slightly below that short-term horizontal support level, right, that we saw on the hourly time scale, right, about 208, right? So that's about $2 thereabouts below the first horizontal support level, right? But if you are looking at a mid-term trade, right, we can also place a long entry, right? Similarly, when the downtrend line is broken convincingly, right? But for mid-term, we can afford a bigger stop loss, right? Possibly below that long-term uptrend line, but at about $190, right? And we can set the first target price, right, at a higher level, right, at the second resistance level at $247, and the second target price, right, at a higher, even higher level, right, at the third resistance level, right, at $290, right? So this is my perspective, right? Let's see how this will pan out in the next week, right? But do take note that this, if the downtrend line does not break convincingly, right, then we do have to wait and see if this stock will actually break down, right, whether the support will actually hold, right? All right, so that's my perspective, right, on Netflix, right, and actually that actually concludes my sharing for Netflix as well. So if you like my sharing for today, right, don't forget to click the like or love button or click the share, right, so that more people can benefit from our sharing, right? And if you're here for the first time, right, do follow us on social media pages, right? So I have a number of social media pages, right, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, right? So you can follow me and my handles over here. FINANCIAlmissy has hers as well on Facebook and Instagram, so do follow her as well, right? And do leave a comment, right, on what you think, right, and suggest the next stock for our next sharing, right? And if you are tuning in religiously, right, do take note that it is held every Sunday at 4 p.m. right? So for next week, right, it will be held on FINANCIAlmissy's Facebook page, right? And to end off, right, just like to shout out, for my next session tonight, right, on cryptocurrency, right? For tonight, right, at 9:30 p.m., right, I'll be talking more on not just Bitcoin, but also on whether the next recession is coming soon, right? So for those of you, who are interested, right, you might want to tune in, right? This might, be something that you might be interested in, right? Because the Dow Jones actually just dropped 900 points, right, on Friday, right? So you might be concerned whether you want to actually hold your stocks, right, or to sell everything, right, and hold more cash, right? So do keep a lookout, right? Tonight at 9:30 p.m. if you can actually watch it live, right? If not, you can also watch the replay, right? I'll also post it on my Facebook page, right? And with that, right, we've come to the end of today's session, right? Hope all you have gleaned something useful from our stock picking session, right? And don't forget to leave a comment below, right, on what you would like us to share next week, right, next Sunday, right? So with that, I hope everyone is having a great Sunday, and see you guys next Sunday once again at 4 p.m. Right, CA1